Hi, this is Kevin Kraut, Ogden Kraut's son. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the new things that are happening in the church. Obviously, some of this that I discuss is probably classified around a folklore or things that my parents or my father or other people had talked about. I'm recording most of these because people will ask me to retell the story over and over, and I just don't really have time to tell it 100 times or 20 times or whatever. So what I'm trying to do now is trying to explain a little bit about the Spencer W. Kimball's experience in his time and with the blacks and the priesthood. Now, just recently there was an article, I believe it's in the Salt Lake Tribune. It was done by Peggy Fletcher Stack. It's called Mormon Church Denounces Folk Beliefs About Blacks and Priesthood. And it says that the LDS Church strongly denounced racism Wednesday and dismissed folk beliefs about why the Utah-based faith banned blacks from its all-male priesthood until 1978. And apparently a lot of the information that comes from there comes from Brigham Young University and of course all the different professors that came from there. One of the folklores about this was kind of an interesting one because there was a gentleman who told me a story. He said that a lot of the information that President Kimball got, he was trying to make a decision. He sent down to BYU, who are very liberal in their views, and most of those professors, I don't know where they come from, but anyway. And so they decided that what they'd do is they would sit down and they'd write a report for President Kimball about the blacks and about the history and where it came from. And of course this is very debatable. You know, there's some people in the church that say, oh, in the very beginning Joseph wanted the blacks to be in the church. There's those who say they didn't even want them in the church. There's debate that he was very good friends with blacks, which he was with a few. But he also, and also in my father's records, there are places where in very great detail it talks about how Joseph actually went back and took some of the one guy that was black from helping to build the temple, asked him not to work with that. He took the priesthood back from him. There are all kinds of things that happened like this. There's all kinds of journals, Mormon journals. It doesn't take much. In this article it makes it sound like the church never really banned it or never had anything to do with it. In reality, they did. They banned it. The blacks did not have the priesthood. They're not trying to cover up things. This is just the way that it was. Now the story I want to tell here is an interesting one because what happened was my father told me that he got a phone call from one of the people who watched over President Kimball or guarded him or took care of him. And apparently he knew Dad, and he called and trusted Dad to be honest with him. And he called and said, you know, Ogden, there's a pamphlet or statement or something that has been said by somebody that was written, and we need to know what it was because President Kimball's been reading this. And as he read this, he went back into his room and he hasn't come out for about 3 days. He hasn't eaten anything or drank anything, and he didn't want to see his wife. And he's really upset, so we want to know if there's anything out there. And I said, okay, I'll check around. So he called the anti-Mormons, Gerald Tanner, and asked him. And he said, no, we haven't got anything out on that yet, and we're still trying to get something. And then he called all the fundamentalist groups, and all the fundamentalist groups, there hadn't been anybody that had done anything. And so finally he called back, and he told this gentleman, he says, the only thing that I can find is that there was a pamphlet that was done. It was an interview with LeGrand Richards that happened not long after the actual giving of the blacks the priesthood. And he says there was a gentleman that called up LeGrand Richards and asked him, was there a great spectacular thing? Did the Savior walk in the room? Was there, you know, whatever it was there anything spectacular? And he said, no, we just all prayed about it and felt good, and that's how it went, type thing. And so, and of course, what's interesting about that is that they actually gave the blacks the priesthood that day. Now back to an earlier story, when I was talking with George P. Lee George P. Lee told me that I asked him specifically about that, and he said that he was in the room when President Kimball got the phone call from Jimmy Carter. And he heard the conversation, and the conversation went much like this. If you have been given many days or many weeks or whatever to make this correct, because you are a 501c3, and under corporate law, you have to comply. And as a corporation, not so much a church, but as a corporation, in complying with that, you cannot have any kind of bar against race, creed, religion, or whatever. And so you have to allow the blacks to hold the priesthood and act and officiate the same as anybody else. And so President Kimball brought his council together, and they decided that that was what they were going to do that day. And they also gave a black the priesthood that day. He did not follow protocol. Protocol in the church is that all the members of the church at conference have to vote on a revelation, to vote it as a real revelation or not a revelation. So he didn't comply in that at all. And there were other things that happened in there as well that were quite interesting. For instance, my father was on a TDY, which is a government type thing back in Washington, D.C. And he was a professional photographer that worked for Dugway Proving Grounds out here in Utah. And he was out there working, and a Secret Serviceman came up and he spotted Dad, and he says, "Well, I know who you are." And Dad said, "Okay, who am I?" You know? He says, "Well, you're that polygamous guy out there in Utah." And he says, "I am." And so they started talking, and he visited with him about different Secret Service stuff and information. And one of the things that he told Dad is, he said, he says, "In 2 weeks' time, the church, your church, will give the blacks the priesthood." And Dad went, "What? How do you know? What do you mean?" And so Dad came back, and he was telling everybody kind of what was told to him, and he was kind of waiting to see what happened, and it was pretty close to 2 weeks. And that happened. They gave the blacks the priesthood. So as far as a revelation is concerned, us here in this world are kind of like, well, yeah, it was more pressure from the government, it was more pressure from what happened. A little like the manifesto, there were things that happened in that as well. Wilford Woodruff took a wife after the manifesto. I mean, there were all kinds of strange things with that. We'll get into the manifesto someday. But anyway, back to the blacks and priesthood. They were barred. The interesting thing is that Dad did some more research on it and never did find anybody who had maybe written that book. And so he asked the guy that was watching over Kimball, he said, "Now, what did the book look like?" And he said, "Well, it was kind of a white book." And Dad goes, "Oh no." He said, "That's my book on segregation of Israel." And he says, if he'd have read that, he said there was a lot of quotes in there by Heber C. Kimball, his great-grandfather, about giving the blacks the priesthood and the condemnation that would come. And the biggest thing was because it was barring between that tribe, the black tribe, and the white tribe. Those two tribes were supposed to stay apart and not be intermixed or intermingled, and that was the great curse. I mean, even going back in biblical days, there were even some of the different tribes of Israel that weren't supposed to mix, So it's very, very important we understand as much as we can on that element. But that's kind of what happened. It's an interesting thing. It just seems strange to me that there's always cover-up. We're embarrassed of our past. It was prophesied that the blacks would have the priesthood someday. According to Brigham Young, he said it was going to be after the millennium that they would actually receive these blessings after all of Abel's children had that opportunity. And so we have a little different beliefs here on that.